Hello, I would like to talk to you about the Luther lens. Imagine that you are about to take your first look at the Mona Lisa. But before you look, someone comes to you and says, "Hey, trust me, put these glasses on first." You assume that this person knows better than you and that they're just trying to help you. So you don't look carefully enough at the glasses to see that the lenses are pretty badly misshapen. So you put the glasses on and you take your first look at the Mona Lisa. And whoa, the eye is really big, and the rest of her face and the ears and her body and everything else it kind of shrinks into the background. You can see those other parts of the picture, but what you focus on the most, of course, is the left eye and the things around it because that's what pops out because of the distortion in the glasses. And this might look really weird to somebody else who's already been looking at the Mona Lisa without those warped glasses on. But see, to you, this looks normal. You think this is how it's supposed to look. This is just the Mona Lisa. And then for the rest of your life, every time you look at that painting, you wear those glasses and you never know what it looks like without them. This is kind of like what can happen to a lot of Christians when they join a church and embrace a certain theological perspective through which they then learn to interpret Jesus and the apostles. What happens when someone joins a conservative evangelical church, or many non-denominational churches, or reformed-leaning churches? What lens do they put on? What glasses are they wearing? Well, they put on this Luther lens. And there's more to it than just Martin Luther. There's the teaching of Augustine and John Calvin and others that contribute to this theological lens, but just for simplicity, we'll call it the Luther lens. To some significant degree, people who join a lot of Protestant churches are going to learn to think about the gospel and to read the Bible through the basic theological lens of Martin Luther, the person who ignited the movement that they have now joined. They might not know much about Martin Luther, but their pastor does. The elders probably do. And they may begin reading popular Protestant literature and listening to Protestant content and media, learning from authors and teachers who have, for the most part, embraced Luther's basic perspective. Just like somebody who joins the Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't have to read any of Charles Russell's works to be influenced heavily by him. They're going to absorb his teachings through the pastor and the people around them just by having casual conversation with other people in the church. And in the same way, if someone joins an evangelical church just a couple years later, and they'll be regurgitating things that they have learned indirectly from Martin Luther through their church community. For example, if you ask many Protestant evangelicals, what New Testament book would you say is most important? Or if you ask them, if you could only give someone one book to read in the New Testament, what book would it be? There's a very good chance that person is going to say either Romans or the Gospel of John. That's what I would have said about 7 or 8 years ago, because I had this idea that Romans is like the central book of the Bible. It's where the gospel is most clearly expressed. It's like the primary source of Christian theology, and the Gospel of John is right there next to Romans. It's like the most important book, John and Romans, and there's nothing in the New Testament that says that. Paul never said that his letter to the Romans is the most important book in the New Testament. So where did I get this idea? Well, I had put on the Luther lens. Martin Luther said the following in his preface to the New Testament. If you've never seen this before, it may shock you, which it should. If you have seen this, please listen again carefully and consider just how strange this really is. Luther said, "From all this you can now judge all the books and decide among them which are the best. John's Gospel and St. Paul's epistles, especially that to the Romans, and St. Peter's first epistle are the true kernel and marrow of all the books. They ought rightly to be the first books, and it would be advisable for every Christian to read them first and most. John's Gospel is the one tender, true, chief gospel, far, far to be preferred to the other three and placed high above them. So too the epistles of St. Paul and St. Peter far surpass the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In a word, St. John's Gospel and his first epistle, St. Paul's epistles, especially Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians, and St. Peter's first epistle are the books that show you Christ and teach you all that is necessary and good for you to know, even though you were never to see or hear any other book or doctrine. Therefore, St. James' epistle is really an epistle of straw compared to them, for it has nothing of the nature of the gospel about it. And Luther also said in his preface to the book of Romans, this letter is truly the most important piece in the New Testament. It is purest gospel. All right, well, now it makes sense why I learned to think in the way I did during all my years at various evangelical churches. Remember the Mona Lisa illustration from the beginning of this video? This is what happens to someone who looks at the New Testament through Luther's glasses. At first, if they didn't put those glasses on, the New Testament would look kind of like that. Everything's in balance. They would begin in Matthew and start with Jesus, but you put on Luther's glasses and whoa, Romans and John jump out at you, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of shrink into the background a bit, and Galatians and Ephesians are super big too. They're really important, but Romans is just the kernel of the gospel, the chief kernel of the gospel. It's just, and John, you got to read John. You can't spend too much time on these books. You take those glasses off and it goes back to normal. Put them back on. Whoa, John and Romans, and take them off. Boom. John and Romans, Galatians, Ephesians. A lot of evangelicals know that Luther said these kind of things, but they might not be too worried about it because, sure, okay, maybe this is a little bit out of balance. Maybe Luther had some, problems, but this isn't really a big deal, right? I mean, he still could have basically had it right in how he was seeing things. And he did help us to get away from that awful problem of indulgences, so that was good. I don't think a lot of Protestants really understand just how bad this really is. To illustrate how dangerous this is, imagine if you heard about some other teacher who had broken away from the Catholic Church, but who had a different view of things. Their lens looks more like this. James. Oh, James. James is the chief, tender, heart and kernel of the gospel. It is purest gospel. This is the most important piece in the New Testament. And Matthew. Matthew is far, far above the other gospels, Mark, Luke, and John. And Hebrews and 2 Peter. Those four books, James, Matthew, Hebrews, and 2 Peter. If you just read those books and nothing else, you got everything you need to know about the gospel. The other books are good. They're good. It's all the Word of God. Romans and Galatians, there isn't really much of the gospel. There's nothing of the nature of the gospel in Romans and Galatians. They're epistles of straw. But James and Matthew, that's where it's really at. Read them first and most. How would you feel about this? If you heard that, would you think, yeah, this is great. I should listen to this person? Or would you think, okay, well, maybe something's a little off about this, but that's okay. It's basically right. Or would you think, what in the world? This is heresy. How could they say that about Romans and Galatians? Something is horribly wrong here. And would you want to go to people and warn people about this person and say, listen, please listen to me. this is really twisted. I know that this person's talking about the Bible and they appear to be a great teacher and everything, but this is not true Christianity. Please do not let this person shape the way you think. Why did Luther think that James had nothing of the nature of the gospel about it? Is it because James didn't know the gospel? Did he write a letter and forget to put any gospel in there? Or is it possible that Luther didn't see the gospel in James because he had the wrong gospel? Maybe he couldn't see his twisted gospel anywhere in James because it isn't there in James. When in reality, James is full of the true gospel, just like Romans is. Anyone who doesn't think that there's any gospel to be found in James or in Romans, you can be sure that something is really wrong there. And you don't want that person, you don't want someone with either of these warped lenses teaching you how to think. How about removing that lens and going back to the beginning and starting again in Matthew chapter 1 and letting Jesus be the theologian, not Luther or Calvin or Catholic or Orthodox traditions. Jesus is the one who can show us the way things are. He is the one who can explain to us what the gospel basically is, what salvation is all about, what Jesus' role is in salvation, what our role is in salvation. Let him shape the way we think about things and the way we talk about the gospel in the Christian life. And then we can move forward from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John into the book of Acts. And we can learn from the apostles. What did they emphasize? What was at the heart of their gospel preaching? How did they think about things? How did they talk to the church? How did they live? And then we can move forward from there into the epistles and understand them through the lens that Jesus and the apostles have provided in their preaching and teaching. We don't need Martin Luther. We don't need, theologians of the Protestant church or Catholic church or whatever. Jesus and the apostles give us the right lens through which to understand Paul's epistles. That's very important because Paul's epistles have a very, very particular context that needs to be understood. And part of the reason Luther loved Romans so much is because he misunderstood it. And if we do this, if we go back to the beginning with Jesus and forget everything we think we know and just start again with him in Matthew chapter 1 and let him rewire us, if we're open to whatever Jesus and the apostles have to say about what it's all about and how we need to live as his followers, then unless you're a very unusual Christian, especially in a place like America, you need to get ready because the road ahead is about to get a lot more narrow and a lot more difficult and also a lot more exciting. God bless you and thank you so much for listening. And please send me a message if you would like to talk.